Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
They all stood in the dining room, pressed together like petals in a bouquet someone else arranged, clinking their glasses and laughing as if the air itself had turned into champagne, their voices rising in unison to sing a slightly off-key version of Happy Birthday. To my younger sister, Christine, who, at 32, still tilted her head like a child whenever someone complimented her dress. There were phones raised in every direction, capturing her surprised face, her big eyelashes blinking at the candles on a cake she didn't bake, in a house she didn't help clean, surrounded by decorations she hadn't lifted a finger to hang. I was in the kitchen, scraping dried cheese from the bottom of a lasagna pan, using the wrong side of a cheap plastic fork because the sponge had mysteriously disappeared again. Probably used once and discarded like most things that didn't immediately serve their purpose in this house. The sound of celebration floated into the kitchen like the muffled echoes of a different life, one I wasn't invited to join but was expected to support from behind the curtain. That's what I was, not the audience, not the star, not even the lighting crew. I was the damn broom closet. I didn't hear anyone call my name, and when I peeked around the corner to see the group photo being taken, I realized with a strange, hollow detachment that no one noticed I wasn't in it. Not Mom, who stood beside Christine with her hand on her shoulder like she was being knighted. Not Dad, who hovered in the back row, holding a balloon that read #OneDaughter, probably picked up by accident, though I wasn't sure anymore. And certainly not Christine, who looked radiant in her pale yellow sundress, smiling like a woman who had never once felt second. I rinsed my hands in lukewarm water that smelled faintly of forgotten tuna, then dried them with the only clean towel, the one I had brought in my own bag, knowing how these things go. There's always a point at these gatherings when you realize the line between family and obligation has blurred beyond recognition, and I had stopped pretending to be surprised by it years ago. What did surprise me, though, or maybe not surprise, but momentarily jolt me into clarity, was the moment I reached for a fresh fork to eat a sliver of cake and noticed none were clean. I glanced down at the pile of used ones in the sink, all thrown there without so much as a rinse, as if the magic dish fairy were expected to swoop in after midnight. I picked one up, a flimsy white fork, probably from a leftover takeout bag, rinsed it with soap and a grimace, then, without really thinking, slipped it into my purse. Maybe it was petty. Maybe it was stupid. But at that moment, it felt like claiming something. Anything that hadn't already been taken from me. The moment passed, the party carried on, and I drifted through it like a ghost at her own funeral, smiling politely at people I didn't recognize, answering the same 3 questions, still single, still working at the library, and still doing that writing thing. I nodded, laughed, and resisted the urge to explain that working with rare books doesn't mean I sit around sniffing parchment in the dark or that writing essays for university presses is, in fact, still a real job, even if Mom likes to call it a hobby with a website. I hugged Aunt Mara goodbye when she left early. She always leaves early, ever since her 3rd husband died at a gas station, and I refilled the water pitchers when the lemonade ran out, even though nobody asked me to. Especially because nobody asked me to. As the evening dimmed into the dull buzz of post-cake cleanup and overly long goodbyes, I found myself back in the kitchen, now mostly empty, except for a stack of dirty plates and a fly that had made itself at home on the edge of a bowl of potato salad. Christine had wandered off to the back patio with her friends, wineglass in hand, head tilted back in laughter. I looked around for Mom and spotted her coming down the hallway, carrying a small box of used paper napkins, humming to herself like she was still caught in the glow of Christine's spotlight. She smiled when she saw me, a practiced, automatic smile, not warmth, but etiquette. The kind of smile you give a neighbor who waters your plants when you're out of town. "I'll finish these," I said, gesturing at the dishes. She didn't argue. She never does. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. She paused, adjusted the pearl clip in her hair, and nodded. "You've always been helpful," she said, in that soft tone that people use when they're saying something that feels like a compliment but tastes like a pill. She turned to walk away, and I just knew, that if I let her go, this would be another night I'd carry in silence, stacking it on top of all the others that had come before it, until I couldn't move under the weight anymore. So I said it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. I just leaned slightly toward her, like I was sharing a secret, and let the words fall in a tone so calm it took her a second to register what I'd said. "You know," I whispered, "sometimes I wonder what it's like to have a mother." She didn't flinch, not right away. Her face stayed neutral for half a heartbeat too long, like her brain hadn't decided whether to process it as an insult or a malfunction. Then she blinked once, twice, turned her head just slightly, and gave me a look that I could only describe as unreadable. Not anger. Not sadness. Just blank space. And then she left the room. I washed the last dish in silence, dried my hands on my towel, grabbed my purse, the fork inside rattling gently against a tin of mints, and walked out through the side door, unnoticed. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A message from Christine. "What did you say to Mom?" "She's locked herself in her room." I didn't reply right away. I didn't feel rushed. Because for once, they were the ones wondering what I had said. And I had no intention of giving them the answer that easily. It's strange, really, how memory works. Not like a neat file cabinet, but more like a drawer jammed shut, and when you pull too hard, everything comes spilling out in no particular order. Every image coated in the dust of time and bias and whatever lies we've told ourselves to keep going. When I got home that night, the silence in my apartment felt less like peace and more like a waiting room, like the quiet between words you haven't yet decided to speak. I stood in my kitchen, still wearing the dress I'd bought on clearance for the party, my hair pinned up in a way I already regretted, staring at the untouched slice of cake Mom insisted I take home, still in its plastic container on the counter. It looked ridiculous, really, perfect white frosting piped in fake elegance over something dry and bland underneath, and I remember thinking that if my sister were a dessert, she'd probably be that exact slice, photogenic, heavily sweetened. Adored on the surface, and yet fundamentally unremarkable once you get past the decoration. I didn't cry. That would have been too easy, too expected, too theatrical, and besides, I hadn't cried over my family in years, not since the day I realized that being the eldest daughter didn't mean being loved more, or even respected, but simply meant being the default adult in every room where someone else got to be the child. Christine, of course, was always the child. Even when she was 25 and somehow managed to rack up over $10,000 in credit card debt because she felt like she deserved nice things, even when she broke up with her fiancé 3 months before the wedding and blamed it on Mercury being in retrograde, Mom coddled her like she was made of glass, like she was a fragile heirloom too delicate to hold accountable. Me? I was the buffer, the responsible one, the one who could be trusted to figure things out on her own, which was just a polite way of saying, we stopped asking if you were okay because you never made a scene. Growing up, the difference between us was never overt, never something that could be pointed to in a photo or listed on a birthday invitation, but it lived in the smallest gestures, the way Mom's tone would soften when speaking to Christine, the way she would touch her shoulder gently when guiding her through a crowded room, the way she'd lean in during conversations as if Christine's words held deeper wisdom, even when she was talking about celebrity gossip or her latest wellness cleanse. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when I showed up with a homemade pie I'd spent hours baking, crust perfectly golden, the filling just hard enough to make you pause and appreciate it. Christine brought a store-bought cheesecake from a gas station, still in the branded plastic box, and Mom looked at her like she'd invented dairy. "You're so thoughtful," she had said, hugging her tightly, and I stood there holding my pie, smiling like a background character, wondering how a woman could raise 2 daughters and only remember to praise one of them. The worst part, I think, was not the favoritism itself, but the way it was denied, the way any mention of it was met with performative confusion and the sort of defensive silence that says, "How dare you accuse me of something I don't have the emotional vocabulary to admit?" When I tried to bring it up once, just once, in my late 20s, after Christine had been gifted a car just because she needed it while I was still paying off my student loans, I was told I was imagining things, that I was reading into normal parenting choices, that I was being ungrateful. Mom even laughed, a dry little chuckle like I had just told a joke that made her slightly uncomfortable. "You're the strong one," she said, as if that were a compliment. As if strength had ever kept anyone warm. Over time, I stopped trying. I let Christine have the spotlight, the applause, the sympathetic glances when she forgot birthdays or canceled plans or posted vaguely passive-aggressive quotes on social media about toxic people and boundaries. I watched her stumble through jobs and relationships with the safety net of parental grace beneath her, while I kept my head down and built a life from scratch. No loans, no handouts, just quiet persistence and the occasional stiff drink when the silence got too heavy. I learned how to survive invisibility, how to make a home in the shadow of someone who wasn't better, just better loved. But memory, like I said, isn't a straight line, and sometimes the smallest things drag old truths into the light. A few months ago, I was cleaning out a drawer in Mom's old storage chest, the one she left with me during her last move, and I found a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Most were holiday cards, some were receipts, and then, tucked between two old recipes, was an envelope addressed to me, in my mother's handwriting. The return address was from a college I had once applied to, a dream program in creative writing I never got a reply from, a place I had talked about with so much hope that it felt like a betrayal when the silence came. I opened the envelope slowly, my hands trembling, and pulled out a letter I had never seen before, a formal offer of admission, dated 3 weeks before I gave up and accepted a lesser option. Written in neat cursive across the bottom, in the same familiar ink, were the words, "I didn't think this would be the right path for you." I never sent it. That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just a quiet confession buried in a drawer, as if erasing my opportunity had been a kindness she didn't need to share. I didn't confront her. I didn't scream or demand answers or even cry. I just folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it in a box under my bed, next to the list of other things I'd learned not to talk about. Because that's what you do when you're the strong one. You carry things. You hold the weight of other people's choices and pretend they're your own. But that night at Christine's party, as I stood there doing the dishes, hands slick with grease and fragments of celebration, something inside me cracked, not like an explosion, but like ice under pressure. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply done. And that's a kind of power too, the quiet kind, the kind no one sees coming. So when I leaned in and said those words to Mom, I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was just stating a fact I had carried for years. And the look in her eyes, brief, stunned, almost childlike, told me that, for the first time in decades, she had actually heard me. Now they're asking what I said. But the truth is, they already know. They just didn't expect it to come from me. The first message came at 11:42 p.m., lighting up the screen of my phone with the cold, sterile glow of panic dressed as curiosity. "What did you say to Mom?" A second followed almost immediately after, as if Christine had typed it with trembling thumbs before I even had time to process the first. "She won't talk to me. She locked herself in her room and won't answer." "What did you do?" I stared at those words from the silence of my bedroom, the room dark except for the bedside lamp casting a soft pool of gold over my comforter, the kind of light that makes you feel like time has stopped or, at the very least, that nothing important can reach you while you're under it. I didn't answer right away, not because I was trying to be cruel or mysterious, but because I genuinely wasn't sure how to explain something that hadn't been shouted, hadn't been weaponized, hadn't even been intended as a grenade. Just a sentence. Spoken quietly, like the truth finally exhaling after years of being held hostage in the lungs. The phone buzzed again. This time the tone was more clipped, like Christine had gone from concerned daughter to the unofficial spokesperson of the Family Damage Control Committee. "Just tell me what you said." "I don't understand." "She's crying. She won't come out. She keeps saying your name." That part made me pause. Not because it surprised me, but because something about it felt vaguely surreal, like I'd slipped into an alternate timeline where I mattered enough to haunt someone. For most of my life, I could have disappeared for days without anyone noticing. Now, suddenly, I was the focal point of a melodrama I hadn't auditioned for, cast as the antagonist in a story that had only ever been written from Christine's point of view. I set the phone down and made tea, not because I was thirsty, but because ritual comforts me, the sound of the water boiling, the rhythm of pouring, the soft clink of the spoon against ceramic. All reminders that I existed outside of the demands of anyone else's perception. As the steam curled into the air like a whisper I didn't have to answer, I thought about what I could say, not just to Christine, but to anyone who might ask. I could have told them about the letter I found, the one Mom never mailed, and how that single action reshaped the course of my entire future without my consent. I could have told them about the birthday I spent alone at 18 after Mom and Dad took Christine to New York because she'd been feeling sad, leaving me with a cupcake and a voicemail. I could have told them about the way Mom rewrote every story in our family like a novelist with a vendetta. Christine became brave for quitting her job after 3 weeks, while I was stubborn for sticking with mine. Through layoffs and burnout, Christine's mistakes were growing pains, mine were character flaws. Christine was emotional, I was cold. Christine was passionate, I was difficult. But none of that would have answered Christine's question, not really. What she wanted wasn't truth. What she wanted was closure, something neat and palatable she could present to Mom through the locked door like a peace offering, a rational explanation that could restore the balance of their relationship and reassure them both that nothing irreversible had happened. And the truth is, I didn't give her that because I didn't owe it to her, not anymore. So instead, I typed out a reply that said, "What do you mean?" and left it at that, vague, disarming, and entirely accurate. Let them wonder. Let the silence stretch. I knew, of course, that this would drive Christine insane. She never could tolerate ambiguity. Everything in her world needed a label, of a reason, a villain, and preferably one she could cry to Mom about while being reassured she was still the good one. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. I didn't need to win. I just needed to stop pretending I hadn't already lost. That night, as I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and old pages, I always forget to do laundry on time, I imagined the scene at Mom's house. Christine pacing outside the locked bedroom door, her voice rising and falling as she pleaded for a response, the occasional knock followed by prolonged silence, and Mom, inside, sitting on the edge of the bed, not crying in the way that demands comfort, but simply unraveling in the quiet. I could picture her surrounded by memories she couldn't edit, faced for the first time in years with the version of me she never wanted to acknowledge, the one who didn't need permission to speak anymore. At one point, the phone rang. Christine again. I let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave one. Instead, she sent one final message, shorter this time, almost plaintive. She won't eat. She keeps saying she messed everything up. I don't get it. I did. I got it entirely. You see, the thing about guilt, real guilt, the kind that sits in your bones and whispers when the house goes quiet, is that it doesn't need anyone to shout at you to feel sharp. Sometimes all it takes is a mirror, or worse, reflection in someone else's eyes that finally matches what you've spent years trying to avoid. I hadn't accused her. I hadn't listed her failings. I hadn't even used her name. I had simply said one sentence, the kind that, if it lands at just the right moment, slices deeper than any tantrum or dramatic exit ever could. And now, the house was echoing with it. I could have ended it right there. I could have sent Christine a perfectly crafted explanation, something half-true and soaked in diplomacy, something that would have smoothed the edges and wrapped this little crisis in a neat emotional bow, but I didn't. Instead, I took another sip of my tea, opened my notebook, and wrote down everything I remembered about that night. Not for them. For me. Because even though I had finally said something out loud, I knew they hadn't really heard me yet. They were still waiting for the dramatic reveal, the villain monologue, the confession that would absolve everyone and restore the status quo. But that's not what I gave them. I gave them silence. I gave them uncertainty. I gave them the echo of something they chose not to see, and sometimes, that's more powerful than any scream. The door was already shut when I arrived, not slammed in the kind of melodramatic gesture one might expect from a teenager in crisis, but simply and solidly closed. as though someone had decided they'd had enough of the outside world and slipped away from it with quiet finality. There was no light seeping out from underneath, no sound of movement, no hint that the person behind it was doing anything but existing in silence, the kind that grows heavier the longer it's unbroken. The house itself smelled faintly of dryer sheets and old rose potpourri, the kind of artificial warmth that pretends to be comfort, but mostly just masks things' staleness, time, or maybe, in this case, something deeper that had been rotting under the surface for years. Christine had texted me 3 times on the way over, asking if I was sure I wanted to do this, if maybe I could just talk to Mom like normal, like this was just another one of her little spells that would pass after a good cry and some chamomile tea, like everything hadn't shifted irreversibly since I'd said one quiet truth at a party no one remembers for the right reasons. I didn't knock. I just sat down at the kitchen table, the same one we'd gathered around for nearly every birthday, holiday, and family dinner that blurred into each other over the years until they all felt like variations of the same script. I noticed the centerpiece was still the one I'd made 4 Thanksgivings ago out of dried leaves and cheap candles, though Mom had sworn up and down that Christine had picked it out herself from some boutique downtown. I traced the edge of one of the placemats, my fingers catching on the loose threads, and I found myself wondering how long something can sit in front of you without being seen, how many things we accept as truth just because we're too tired or too scared to question them. The hallway was dim, the light bulb above flickering faintly the way it always had, like a tired eye unsure whether to open or close. I stood in front of her door and rested my hand against it, not knocking, not speaking yet, just allowing her to feel my presence on the other side. It occurred to me that this might be the first time I'd visited this house not as a daughter coming home, but as something else entirely, an intruder, perhaps, or maybe just a witness to the kind of story no one wants written down. After a while, I spoke, not loudly, not with anger or force, but with the steady cadence of someone who knows she won't be interrupted. "You don't have to open the door," I said, my voice steady even as my heart thudded hard against my ribs. "I'm not here to fight, or yell, or demand anything. I just want to talk." There was no response, but I hadn't expected one. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and let my mind drift through the catalog of memories I'd spent a lifetime trying to organize. Birthdays where Christine's name was piped in frosting while mine was misspelled. School plays where Mom clapped loudest when Christine stumbled through her lines and forgot the ending, but stayed silent during my monologue. The time I won a regional writing award and came home to a kitchen filled with balloons for Christine's promotion, which turned out to be her switching from one temp job to another. These weren't tragedies. They were just layers. Paper cuts. And over time, the accumulation of paper cuts becomes something dangerous. "I found the letter," I said finally, not because I thought it would shock her, but because I wanted her to know I wasn't pretending anymore. "The one from the writing program. The one you didn't send." The silence deepened, thickened, stretched. Still no movement. I continued. "You could have just told me you didn't believe in me. That would have hurt, sure, but at least it would have been honest. Instead, you made the choice for me and let me believe I wasn't good enough." I swallowed hard, the bitterness rising in my throat like smoke. "I spent years trying to earn something you never intended to give." A sound came from behind the door then, barely audible, more breath than voice. "A name." "Mine," whispered. Not in anger, not in disbelief, but something closer to sorrow. Or guilt. Or maybe just surprise that I'd figured it out. I pressed my palm flat against the wood. "You always said Christine needed more from you because she was fragile, but maybe the truth is you gave her everything because she never threatened to disappoint you." "I did. I challenged your version of things just by existing, just by remembering it differently." I paused, then added, "I think that scared you." The door creaked slightly, as if someone had shifted their weight on the other side, but it didn't open. I sat down on the floor, my back to the wall, knees pulled to my chest. For a moment, I let myself remember being small, being 7, being the one who always waited until everyone else had been served before I took a slice, who cleaned up quietly, who listened while Christine cried and raged and broke things because she wasn't getting enough attention. I remembered the way Mom used to hug her tightly and call her my little hurricane, while I was praised for being calm, for being easy, for never needing anything. That's what I was, the emotional housekeeper. The storm shelter. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, one I'd prepared the night before. I slid it under the door slowly, not saying anything more, just letting the gesture speak. Inside wasn't a letter or an accusation or some dramatic manifesto. It was a single photograph, me, 10 years old, standing alone at the edge of a party, the cake already cut, the chairs emptying out, my smile caught mid-tremble as I held a plate in one hand and looked directly into the lens, as if I already knew no one else would remember that moment but me. I didn't expect her to pick it up. I didn't expect her to respond. Eventually, I stood, stretched my legs, and walked back toward the kitchen, pausing for a moment to glance back down the hallway. Still no sound. But something in the air felt changed, like the charge after a lightning strike, silent, but crackling with invisible energy. I left without saying goodbye. On the drive home, I rolled down the window and let the wind rush against my face, the night air sharp and cold and cleansing. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken either. I just felt real. Seen. Even if only by myself. Sometimes we wait years for someone to tell our side of the story. And sometimes we realize that we are the only ones who ever could. There's a moment, somewhere between clarity and detachment, where your memory stops acting like a record and starts behaving more like a myth, bending and reshaping itself around the significance of what you felt, rather than what actually happened. And I think I had been living in that moment for longer than I realized, not because I wanted to, but because so many of my experiences had been dismissed, rewritten, or flattened under someone else's version of events that I'd begun to question. The shape of my own story, whether it was too jagged, too selfish, too loud in places where silence was expected. But now, in the wake of everything, the locked door, the unanswered messages, the weight of a photo silently received, but never acknowledged, I found myself sitting on my own couch, hands resting over my knees. Not with the triumph of someone who had finally been heard, but with the stillness of someone who had finally stopped trying to explain herself to people who had never cared to listen in the first place. It had been 3 days since I visited the house. Christine hadn't texted again. Mom hadn't emerged, at least not in any way that made it back to me, and I hadn't reached out either, not because I was holding a grudge, but because I knew, with a kind of bone-deep certainty that doesn't need confirmation, that there was nothing left to clarify. In a family like mine, the truth was never something spoken directly, it was something implied, suggested, hinted at in glances and sighs and carefully measured silences that said more than words ever could. So when Christine had demanded, repeatedly, frantically, "What did you say to her?" it wasn't confusion that drove her, but fear, the realization that something irreversible had shifted, and that, for once, it wasn't her who controlled the narrative. The irony is, the sentence wasn't planned. I hadn't rehearsed it in my head or written it in a journal or waited for the perfect moment to release it like a weapon. It came to me, quiet and unadorned, in that strange in-between space when you're elbow-deep in soap suds, your back aching from hours of standing, your mind buzzing from being overlooked so thoroughly that you start to feel transparent. I'd handed Mom a stack of plates, same as I had done for decades, and she'd looked at me with that worn, distracted smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes, the one that suggested she was already thinking about what dessert to plate for Christine and her friends. And something inside me just gave. "You know," I said, my voice low and calm, "sometimes I wonder what it's like to have a mother." That was it. That was the sentence. Not an accusation. Not a scream. Not a pointed list of grievances with dates and emotional receipts. Just a quiet wondering, spoken aloud, in a moment so mundane it almost didn't seem like it should matter. But it did. It mattered more than anything else I could have said, precisely because it wasn't performative or theatrical or designed to cause a reaction. It was honest. And honesty, in a house built on polite fictions, has a way of detonating the foundation without even trying. I didn't watch her face when I said it. I didn't need to. The silence that followed said everything. It was the kind of silence that hangs in the air like the pause after a dropped glass hits the floor, right before anyone dares to breathe or move. She didn't reply. She just turned and walked out of the room, and that, too, was part of the pattern, avoidance masquerading as composure, silence presented as grace. But this time, the silence didn't follow me home. It stayed with her. Christine had always been the one who demanded explanations, who needed the world to be tidy and legible, who assumed that all things could be fixed with a conversation and a glass of wine. But there are some things you don't unhear. Some things that lodge themselves under your skin, not because they're cruel, but because they're too true to ignore. And for my mother, who had spent a lifetime editing the emotional history of our family to preserve an image of herself she could live with, hearing the suggestion that I had never felt mothered was not just painful, it was destabilizing. It forced her to face a truth she'd buried under years of performative affection, strategic favoritism, and denial. I didn't know if she would ever open the envelope I left her. I didn't know if the photo of that 10-year-old girl, standing slightly off to the side, smiling nervously into a camera she hadn't expected to be pointed at her, would ever be acknowledged. But I knew with unwavering clarity that she had looked at it. I knew because when you drop a mirror in front of someone who's been carefully avoiding their reflection, the reaction isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just disappearance. The truth is, I didn't want revenge. Not really. I didn't want apologies or dramatic reconciliation or some movie scene confession of past wrongs. I just wanted space to live without being cast as the background character in someone else's highlight reel. And somehow, by speaking that one sentence, I had taken it. Not demanded. Not begged. Just taken. In the days that followed, I planted a few herbs on the balcony. I signed up for a local book club, one where no one knew my last name or my family history or that I had once been the invisible daughter. I went to the grocery store and bought myself flowers, not as a statement, but simply because I wanted to see something living on my table. And one evening, as the sun bled into the sky and my phone sat quiet beside me, I allowed myself to feel the absence, not as loneliness, but as breath. Because I hadn't burned a bridge. I had simply stopped walking toward one that had never led me home in the first place. And as for Christine, maybe someday she'll ask again, with less desperation and more sincerity. Maybe someday she'll want the story, not the headline. Maybe, or maybe not. But if she ever does, I'll tell her this. I didn't say it to hurt her. I said it to stop hurting myself.